there could be, I'm sure, some brand new inspectors in the room, or maybe someone from industry or a consultant who you just decided, oh, this one looks good. I think I'll go to this class. So I want to make sure you guys know what the acronyms mean. So APSA stands for the Aboveground Petroleum Storage Act. And you probably all knew that, but just in case you didn't, even if there's one person who didn't know what APSA stood for, this slide's for you. And it is found in Chapter 6.67 of the Health and Safety Code. It was effective January 1st, 2008. And I'm sure most of you are aware that the state program was not, being supported and unfunded. So it was transferred to the CUPAs, and we've been implementing the APSA program ever since. We've gone through training. So now, in developing the Unified Program Training Matrix, we are trying to develop consistent training for all the CUPA programs. And we developed a matrix of what would be considered beginning training, what would be intermediate, and what would be advanced training for a CUPA inspector, and trying to come up with classes that, maybe someone in a rural CUPA can watch this class online, and they could get the same training that you guys are getting. As a new inspector, they can take this training online. So they're sort of trying to develop a curriculum, and this is one of those classes that came out of that training matrix. And then the next acronym that I want to talk about is SPCC. When I first got involved with this, I kept switching what's the C's. Control and countermeasure, or countermeasure and control. So there you go, spill prevention, control, and countermeasure. And it's found in Title 40 of CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 112. It's been around for many, many years, and then it's gone through various amendments, which we'll talk about a little bit. And there are other classes at the CUPA conference that Pete Reich is teaching where you can ask questions specifically about SPCC. And, of course, protecting, in fact, navigable waters. All right, so let's get started. I want you to try the clickers. All right? So the way it works is it's like opening your garage door. Just push it and let go. You don't have to keep pushing it, okay? And it's going to capture whatever you let go of last, so the last answer you pick. So if you change your mind, whatever's the last answer that you pick. Okay, so here's the 4 questions. Number 1 on your clicker is if you're a regulator. Number 2, if you're a consultant. 3, and so on. And other. I think someone said other earlier was like maybe a prosecutor or a district attorney. Something that could be other. I'm not sure what else other would be. I'm sure you know who you are if you're other. Okay, so let's try this out. You got 10 seconds to give me your answer. All right. Wow. 58 people in the class. Awesome. Okay, good job. Okay, here we go. So here's our results. We have 62% in the room are regulators, 12% are consultants, 24% industry, so that's a good mix. And then who's the other? What is other?
That would be me.
Okay, what's other? I'm curious.
I'm a prosecutor in 15 counties.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. All right. Great.
I should count for 15 times.
Yeah. Great. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So let's keep going. Okay. Now I want to know who knows stuff about APSA here. So if you think you could come up here and teach this class, you're going to push 1. Not today. Don't worry. I'm all set. I'll be okay. But maybe next time. If you know some about APSA, but you'd like to learn more. Or if you have no idea what APSA, and you were the one who was writing down what APSA stood for, then okay, so here we go. All right, great. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking that we would be. Great. Okay, thank you. So 11% could probably teach this class. Some most of you want to learn more, and a very few of you are maybe new inspectors, or you do other programs and you haven't done too much with APSA.
I need to break in right here, and I need to see the show of hands of the 11% that noted that they could teach the class, please. Come on, let's see who wants
So
it.
who's the 11%? Okay.
All right, I'm going to keep that in mind.
You're going to be asking all those hard questions, aren't you? Okay.
I won't let you teach anymore.
Okay. Well, I actually asked Pete to, I volunteered to do this. I haven't actually personally done a lot of APSA inspections. I've helped implement the program, but I asked Pete, well, can you come in case they ask me like any really hard questions? So thank you for being here. And I did post the presentation online by the deadline, so you all should have been able to get the slides. And then I also posted the SPCC guidance for regional inspectors, which I used to develop part of this course. So if you have not already downloaded those, you can. They are available to you. All right. And then, so with the clickers, when you see this little guy here, I'm going to ask you a question and kind of test your knowledge. We're going to review throughout the course, and last of all, in your evaluations, I would really appreciate, because this is the first time doing this class, any feedback you have. I think it's, they're going to get it, not me. So if you want to say, oh, you were too simple, you maybe get into, talk more, or give me suggestions, give the Coupa Forum suggestions on how to improve this class. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. All right. Okay. So now I'm starting with the course. Here we go. So in January 1988, Ashland Oil Company was indicted for violating federal environmental laws in the collapse of a storage tank that spilled more than 500,000 gallons of oil into a river in Ohio near Pittsburgh, the Justice Department announced. Although indictment returned by a federal grand jury in Pittsburgh was on misdemeanor charges rather than on felony charges, the department said conviction could allow the government to recover tens of millions of dollars from Ashland. In what has been described by federal officials as one of the largest inland oil spills in the nation's history, it was actually flowed 200 miles. It created an oil slick that flowed. Supplies of drinking water to many communities was contaminated and interrupted. Thousands of fish, birds, and wildlife were killed. Ashland's chairman, John Hall, conceded that mistakes were made by company employees who were responsible for the tank that ruptured. He acknowledged that company procedures for building and operating storage tanks had not been followed at the site of the spill. 4 million gallon storage tank, it split apart and collapsed. The tank had split while being filled to capacity for the first time after it had been dismantled and moved from Ohio location and then reassembled at the new facility. That was in January of 1988. April 1988. There was another spill, Shell Oil Refinery in Martinez. Late in the evening, April 23rd, 1988, a tank filled with hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude oil began to leak. A hose designed to drain water from the roof of the tank failed. Oil began siphoning out into the containment area surrounding the tank. Unfortunately, a stormwater valve had been left open, and the oil continued to drain into a nearby creek under the freeway and into a marsh. Because it was dark, nobody noticed it, and it took a long time before they figured out that it was actually coming from their facility. And before the source of the spill could be located and stopped, about 400,000 gallons of heavy crude oil had leaked into the environment. So, if you've been doing this for a while, you know this is the source of our environmental laws. These catastrophic events are where our laws start from. And that's what happened. Stronger regulation and enforcement needed to avoid future incidents. So this is your origins of pollution prevention. I'm sure Pete could give other examples. There's been a lot of amendments since 1988. There's a lot of flexibility built into the SPCC rule. In general, the federal rule wants containment. So this class is about containment. And that's what we're going to talk about. It's pretty much a thread that runs throughout the federal rule. And so the concepts around it, if you don't understand them, it's going to be difficult to implement the rule. So what are we going to talk about today? This is where I want you to get out your notepad. Everybody got a pen and a piece of paper? Because you're going to keep me on track, just in case I forget one of these objectives. So the first thing we're going to do is you're going to remember and memorize. When you leave here today, I want you to be able to say, if I say, in what section of CFR 112 do you find general containment? Some of you may already know it, but when you come out of here today, I want you to know which section that is. And which section do you find sized containment requirements? So we're going to talk about those sections, and then also in APSA as well. Number 2 objective is understanding the difference between general containment and sized containment and when it applies. Number 3 is reviewing those nasty exceptions and alternatives. As soon as you got it all figured out, then you find out, oh, there's an exemption to that. And then last of all, for the 62% of you who are regulators, understanding your role as an inspector in evaluating secondary containment. And then not only for inspectors, but for our industry in the audience, what to expect when an inspector comes out, does an APSA inspection, and they are reviewing your SPCC plan, what they're looking for. So this last objective is sort of dual because our audience today is mixed. All right, so here's the first one. And you guys wrote all those down? Everybody got them down, the 4 objectives? All right. Okay, so here's the next thing I want you to write down. 112.7 little c. Everybody got it? Okay, so this is the section where, out of the federal regulations, where we're talking about general containment. How many of you memorize regulations where you can just rattle off those sections? Are you one of those people? My chief is one of those people. He hasn't done inspections for a long time, but he'll go, well, what about in section da-da-da-da-da-da? Did you look in that? And I'm just like, oh, gosh. I'm not one of those people that holds on to that information. I should be. But so hopefully when you leave my class today, you'll remember these sections.
Can I just...
Yes, please.
I did here. I just quickly want to make note that under the SPCC rule, there are requirements that apply to all facilities that are captured by the SPCC rule. And under 112.7, those are the requirements that are omnipresent to all of the SPCC world. So when we're talking about general containment, it's applicable to all facilities and all activities that are where oil is transferred, stored, managed, used, consumed, or otherwise captured by the rule. So when we're talking about 7C here, just note that that's for every single SPCC related facility is going to be captured by that, and so that would carry over into the APSA world too.
Thank you, Pete. All right, so this is one of 4 sections that I'm going to have you write down. This first one, 112.7C, what that says, if you look it up, is provide appropriate, and I won't read the whole thing, I'm just going to sort of paraphrase it, but provide appropriate containment and or diversionary structures or equipment to prevent a discharge. And we're going to talk about what is a discharge just a little bit, but you can learn more about that in another class. And the entire containment system, including walls and floor, must be capable of containing oil and must be constructed so that any discharge from a primary containment system will not escape before cleanup occurs. And then in determining the method and design, we're looking at the most likely discharge for general containment, the most likely discharge. All right? And for general containment as well, there's all sorts of choices. And I'll just give you a few examples that are right out of the regulations, out of this section. Dikes, berms, sumps and collection systems, booms, spill diversion, absorbent materials, etc. And like Pete mentioned, all facilities are subject to general containment requirements. So what you're looking at here would be piping that is attached to a tank, loading areas, transfer areas, oil-filled equipment, which we're going to talk about that too. Pretty much anything that you can think of at your facility, pushing a dolly around with a drum on it, that would be subject to general containment, etc., etc. So, like I already said, it's appropriate containment to prevent the most likely discharge. And that concept, we're going to talk more about it in a minute, but what we're talking about here is we're not looking at the full capacity. What is most likely to release into the environment? So it takes a lot of active approaches and thinking on the part of the facility to decide what is the most likely discharge. The inspector wouldn't make that determination. That's something that the facility would need to make. And it just depends on their equipment, how much they have, how often they do loading and unloading, how often they fill and unload vehicles. Maybe it's just a tank and it never moves. They don't move stuff around. Maybe they get a delivery like every 6 months. Maybe it's an emergency generator. So the appropriate containment to prevent the most likely discharge is really dependent on the facility. So that general containment would be dependent on the facility. Now, as far as a discharge, what is a discharge? Like I said, there's probably a whole nother class on this. But what we're talking about is described in 112.1b, which you don't have to write that down because that's another class. But you can if you want to. 112.1b. And that is in quantities that may be harmful into or upon the navigable waters of the United States. So it could be a sheen. It just depends. But definitely, something as small as a sheen can have an impact, so that would be considered a discharge. Next section, grab out your pen, 112.7 little h. So we've had one section in 112.7. Now we have another one, 112.7h. And we're talking about a very specific equipment at a facility called a loading or unloading rack. How many people have seen these during inspections? Just a few. Okay. They're not very many places. That you don't see them very often, but you might see it once in a while. And who can tell me what type of containment does a loading rack need? Sized containment. Okay, those are the people in the class who know something about APSA. Very good. So that was probably a test question on our inspector exam. And you must design secondary containment for loading and unloading racks to hold at least the maximum capacity of any single compartment of a tank car or tank truck loaded or unloaded at that facility. Now, is there a difference between a loading rack and a loading area? Yes. The answer is yes. And like I said, this is for maybe another class, but one of the things I remember Pete telling us in training and in our training courses that we took is you're looking for those overhead arms, something that is a mechanical fill. Anything else, Pete, on that?
Well, the definition looks at whether there's like a gang or... So Iraq is going to be characterized by being a country next to Iran. Ha! Bad joke. You can see the loading arm component in the photograph where the man is standing on the top of the truck. That's going to be the main feature that would characterize a system like that as a loading-unloading rack. Generally, there's going to be a platform or gangway associated with it too, but you could have those types of components without a loading arm, and that would conceivably keep it from being identified as a rack. EPA amended the rule, the SPCC rule, to update and include a definition of a loading and unloading rack, probably in 2008, I believe, may have been 2006. But that was to identify specifics for rack requirements that do require sized secondary containment based on a truck's largest compartment, as well as to help differentiate transfer areas where you would be conducting the transfer through flexible hose connections, and that's to reduce the containment requirements from sized and move them back into general containment.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know that. All right, so what was the section for general containment? 112.7 little c, very good. All right, so then this is for loading racks, 112.7 little h. Our next section, number 3, this next section is for bulk storage containers and tanks. Please write this section down. So what we're talking about here are our bulk tanks, and this is where a facility is required to construct their containment for bulk storage and drums. That includes drums, bulk storage containers, and tanks, so that you provide a secondary means of containment for the entire capacity of the largest single container and sufficient freeboard to contain precipitation. And that's right in that section. Dikes, containment curbs, and pits are commonly employed for this purpose, and then we'll talk about alternatives later. As far as mobile containers, something you would move around the facility, they are also subject to this section when they're sitting somewhere. When they're moving around, when they're under the control of the operator and it's actually on the dolly, the person's pushing it around, what are they subject to? Anybody? General containment. Very good. Yes, please. It's okay.
So I think a couple points need to be clarified on the general containment requirements. If a facility operator is manipulating, moving, or otherwise using a drum, and it's within their vision and control, would they need to have a general containment, somebody with a sorbent or a dike or a berm of sorts to follow them around? No, there's not a containment requirement while it's under an operational control. If they start a transfer action from the drum to a tanker or some other transfer activity, there would need to be, at a minimum, some sort of active measure available. That would be a sorbent, spill kit, or other sort of deployable method for the operator to splay out or cover a storm drain or something if there was a spill that hit the ground and started flowing. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to be clear. So
thank you. That's good. All right. And then the next section, this is the last section that you're going to write down from the federal regulations, would be the section which we were just talking about, mobile or portable storage containers and tanks. 112.8 little c 11, where it talks specifically about these mobile containers and that they are subject to the sized containment requirements, unless, like Pete mentioned, if it's being moved around. And this is with the exception of mobile refuelers. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute, because there are some exceptions for mobile refuelers. So in the federal guidance for regional inspectors, there's these great charts. And so this is in your download materials. And it actually gives the sections here that you can, I got my little pointer here, It gives the sections for bulk storage containers and the sections I just mentioned, loading and unloading racks, mobile and portable containers, and then other areas. And we're talking about onshore storage facilities. Now, it's funny because I've had a few facilities who've given me a call and they're just now getting their SPCC plan done. And for some reason, they don't think they have to check all these boxes because they say, well, our facility's not right next to the shore. And I'm like, no. They think for some reason they're not subject to this requirement because they see the word onshore. Has anybody else had that kind of a confusion from their facility at all? Or if you noticed it? They may not be wanting to ask you because they think they're supposed to know. So take a close look at those SPCC qualified facility templates and the boxes that they check. Sometimes they're just all left blank. I had a pretty big chain of oil change facilities that left a whole bunch of those boxes blank on their template because they thought this was for like oil rigs because it says, for some reason they saw the word shore and they think that that's something like on a port or something like that. So just to let you know. And then this also talks about impracticability determination, which we're going to talk about that later, and gives other sections. If you look in this guidance, it does talk about production facilities as well and gives those sections. We're not going to be talking about that today, but just so you're aware, there are other sections that would apply for, say, an oil production facility or a offshore oil drilling. If you would look at different sections in the regulations for possibly sized containment or general containment. So these ones that we just got, the 4 that you just wrote down, this is for onshore storage facilities. Most of the facilities we're going to see as APSA inspectors. And for our business and industry in the audience, most likely this is what your facility is. If you have a production facility, you would have different sections that would apply. All right. Anything, Pete? No? Good. Anything? Okay. All right. So now we're moving on to APSA, state law. And we're going to talk about, it's pretty easy. There's not 4 sections in APSA. There's really just one main section. This one right here. So please write this down. 25270.4.5. And in this section, it's pretty much in a nutshell, it says they have to have a federal plan and they have to implement it. And that's, I could read it to you, but that's each owner operator of a storage tank shall prepare an SPCC plan, and they need to conduct the inspections and implement that plan. And that's what it says in that section of APSA. This section down here is probably a good one to jot down as well. That's why I have it up on the screen, because that's where you're going to find your APSA penalties. So if you were to do, let's just say, for example, you gave multiple notices to a facility for preparing an SPCC plan as an inspector, or as an industry person, you get multiple notices from an inspector that you need to do your plan, and for whatever reason the facility does not prepare their SPCC plan and close out that violation. Eventually, our job as the CUPA is to use graduated enforcement, and we may end up writing a notice of violation to that facility and escalating that, possibly doing an administrative enforcement case or something like that to gain compliance. And in that case, you would want to refer to this section, 25270.12a. And in this section, it talks about that if the facility fails to prepare the plan, then they would be subject or be in compliance or implement. There's a lot to it. It's not just having a plan. You have to implement the plan. Then they would be subject to a civil penalty of not more than $5,000 for each day on which the violation continues. And then if they commit a second and subsequent violation, then it could go up to $10,000 per day. Yes?
As the token prosecutor in the room, I'd just like to ask that if you folks see Class 1 violations, that you consider working with your district attorney's office to consider moving that to the respective district attorney's office, because we are interested in taking APSA cases, particularly Class 1 violations, and particularly where we have repeat offenders and such. Thank you.
Okay. And I'll just repeat the question since we're taping. Is a gentleman with the district attorney's office is encouraging CUPAs who are having problems with repeat offenders not in compliance with APSA to be sure to talk to your prosecutors and work with them on cases revolving repeat offenders. A lot of times, in my experience so far, they just haven't gotten around to it. They don't really understand that they need to do the template or whatever. We have most of our, we have about 700 APSA facilities, 750, and about 110 of them are PE certified facilities, over 10,000. The rest are qualified facilities, so about 600 qualified facilities, and they just, we told them to do the SPCC plan, and now we've got to go back and make sure they have it now that we're getting around to that next inspection time frame. And now they haven't done it yet. I'll get to you one sec. And so now it's like, well, we've given you notice, we sent you a letter, you still don't have it, so now we probably have to escalate it and move forward with that. You had a question here?
Is there a specified time frame from the time you let them know they have to prepare an SPCC to when they have to have it?
Okay, so the question was, is there a specified time frame from when you give notice that they have to have an SPCC of when they need to have it? Great question. It has been required, depending on your facility. If you're with if you're a business, depending on your facility. But now all the deadlines are pretty much over, unless you're a farm. You are required to have an SPCC plan in place now, already. As if you were subject to the requirement of having 1320 gallons of oil or more, or petroleum or more, if you're talking about APSA. So when we go in there as an inspector, you are already supposed to have that plan. So the way it works, kind of like with all of our violations, we typically, and it depends on your internal guidance, if you're with a CUPA or if you are a business person, the CUPA that you reside in, usually it's 30 days, sometimes 60, depending on the agency. And then after that time frame is over, if the agency, sometimes they'll ask for extensions. A facility can ask for extension if they need more time. But if once that's exhausted, then it would be required. So I would say it depends is the answer, but I would say it would range between 30 to 60 days, depending on what the facility has to implement. Your agency might decide to work with a facility if maybe they have to retrofit an area, and it's going to take them a few months to get that capital together to do those retrofits and implement the plan. Okay, great. Good question. Thank you. And please ask questions throughout. All right, so our goal in APSA and the federal requirements, spill prevention, control, and countermeasure. So when I think control, I think that some type of containment or active measures that you're putting in place to prevent releases, prevent discharge. Now, can somebody in the audience tell us what is an SPCC plan? Anybody? Oh, come on. This gentleman right here. Yes, sir. Tell us what an SPCC plan is. I'll give you some candy. I have a few pieces left.
Plan number one, to assess what you have, to actually figure out how you're not going to have releases in the first place, how to contain any releases you have, and most importantly, what you're going to do with it when you have a release to prevent it from reaching a navigable water. And,
excellent.
That includes training, that includes inspections, includes a lot of different aspects to it.
Very good. Very good. What's your name?
Tom Parker.
Tom Parker. From where? Butte County. Awesome. Butte County. There you go. All right. Okay, very good. So for our video, it details the equipment, workforce, procedures, and training to prevent, control, and provide adequate countermeasures for the discharge of oil And if you're already familiar with APSA, you know with APSA we're talking about petroleum, which is a subset of oil. And you would have gotten more about the difference between APSA and SPCC and petroleum and oil. That's in an earlier class, so that's not for today. If you're a little confused on that, see me after class. We've got some online training that you can check out. So when we're talking about the above ground storage tank program, it was enacted in 1990, and the goal of that program was to protect vegetation, wildlife, surface water, human health, and groundwater in the state of California from the damaging effects of petroleum. And so what we have to do in implementing that program as a CUPA is to review and implement the SPCC plan, make sure the SPCC plans are being implemented at the facility, and then make sure the facility has installed any release detection systems that they need to have in place, require and investigate if you think you have violations where there's been releases at that facility, and then if there have been releases, make sure that corrective action occurs for cleanup of those releases, and then of course to inspect the facilities, and then now we have our Office of the State Fire Marshal that is going to be overseeing the program. Many of the CUPAs have implemented and made it part of their fee structure to charge a fee to permitted facilities for APSA. Some have decided to not charge their qualified facilities, but they're still implementing the program for those facilities. Every CUPA is doing it a little bit differently. There's going to be a panel tomorrow talking about implementation at the different CUPAs. So what we're talking about here, though, in general, in a nutshell, is just protecting the waters of the state and protecting navigable waters. And navigable waters does include storm drains, by the way. I know I've been talking about the state program right now, but this does apply to the federal program. All right, so get out your clickers. We're going to do a question just to see if you're awake and paying attention here. Okay? So your question is, what regulations are known as the oil pollution prevention regulations? All right, you got 10 seconds. Very good. Awesome. Okay, good. Most of you are paying attention. Some of you might have misclicked. But yes, 40 CFR 112 is the right answer. All right. Let's go to our next question here. So hopefully I didn't trip you up there. But what does the first C in SPCC stand for? Here you go. 10 seconds. Your last click. Good, good. All right, very good. Control is the answer. Okay, one more. Does APSA have secondary containment requirements that are stricter than the federal SPCC regulations? And remember the section I talked to you about? You guys are talking to each other with your brain. Oh, that was good. How did you plan that? Okay. Okay. So no, we do not have requirements that are stricter, but somehow you all talked to each other in the audience and decided to trick me here.
Yeah, we have to take water from the state. That's a little tricky.
Yeah, it is a little tough question.
Okay. Well, I see what you're saying.
But
Just, I mean, let's say,
Yeah, exactly. That water's the state.
Okay. Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. Okay, I'm sorry. So I thought you were all tricking me, but actually in reality my question was flawed. So because APSA is talking about the waters of the state, some are saying that technically that means APSA is stricter than the federal rule.
I just would like to jump in, and the discussion of the federal requirements are driven solely by protection of surface waters that are in fact navigable or their adjoining shorelines, which Sandy mentioned and those would be inclusive of storm drains and culverts and other things that are going to make their way, intermittent streams that maybe don't flow that often, but if they make their way to a navigable water, that's going to be adjoining shorelines. And our federal rule under the Clean Water Act is solely driven by protection of, in fact, navigable waters, the surface waters, bays, lakes, rivers, streams, wetlands in certain cases, whereas APSA is driven by including protection of waters of the state. So the reality is the APSA rule doesn't have more stringent specific requirements for secondary containment. They are the same, but the requirements under the APSA rule and the federal SPCC differ in that APSA captures waters of the state, which does include groundwater. Is that
Yes.
Is that right?
Some facilities might be do an SPCC federally because they're not going to impact navigable waters, but for California, they might have.
Okay, so
And we could get into a long, crazy discussion that goes around and around and around on that.
I didn't anticipate this but it's good. It's good discussion. So the gentleman here was mentioning that some facilities may not require an SPCC plan for feds, but again, that one kind of makes my brain spin a little bit. I haven't quite wrapped my head around it. So we can talk more in implementation panel tomorrow about that point. All right, so I've covered my first objective, I think I have. What was the first objective? I should have written them down. Yes, very good. Thank you. I have candy for you. You're too far. I might hit somebody. Okay, so we identified secondary containment statutes and regulations and terminology directly related to the SPCC program and APSA. So we've covered that. So now we want to talk about the difference between general and specific containment. Under general containment, what we're talking about is, like I already mentioned, what would be the typical failure mode, the most likely discharge. And of course, it can be active containment or passive in design. And who can tell me what's the difference between active and passive? Anybody? Back in the back there?
Active would be like fire department standing by during fueling operations. Passive is engineered specific containment, where nobody's standing by, it's always there. Burns.
Good. So active would be, if I can repeat what you said, like a fire department standing by to react to the release, and then passive is something that's already there, engineered and in place already. Very good.
I would just clarify that in this context, active is going to be more like a spill kit available to the operators or storm recovery.
Right. So in this, and Pete is just saying to make sure I clarify that what we're talking about here, not only the fire department standing by, but having a spill kit ready to go with someone who can go and put the absorbent on the spill. And when we're reviewing that, and we're going to talk about the inspector's role later, some of the things to think about as a facility or as an inspector is if they have a spill kit, is it a 24-hour operation? Is there always going to be somebody who can use that spill kit and implement it? And is it refilled? Open up the container, look inside the spill kit, see if it actually has absorbent and pads and stuff in there. And then, of course, Passive is, like we already said, already there. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then, so the facility sort of gets to decide. It's all performance-based. And we're looking at the potential for discharge. And they need to implement good engineering practices depending on their operation. And these are the things, as an inspector, that we want to make sure we are not mandating something that maybe doesn't apply for that facility. So it may be one facility, they can't use active because they don't have a 24-hour operation. They don't have enough staff that would be able to put absorbent on the spill. And at another facility, they do have 3 shifts and someone who can use the absorbent. So it's just something to kind of think about as an inspector.
Can I jump in again?
Yes. No, it's good.
I just want to ask you folks, the inspectors primarily, if a facility tells you that they rely on active measures for general containment, for a transfer area, or, well, not really that because that's a manned operation, but let's say a mobile refueler, which we haven't quite got to yet, but they're subject to general containment. You see a mobile refueler truck sitting on a facility in the middle of their parking area, and you ask them if they have any form of containment for that truck. And they tell you that they rely on active measures. They point to a spill kit over here. You go through the motion of determining what's in the spill kit and if they've had any training on that sort of deployment. And then you ask them, well, what are your hours of operation? We're here Monday through Friday till 5 p.m. We shut down for the weekend, and we go home, returning Monday morning. Then you look over there, and you see a storm drain just right there in proximity with a direct line of flow. Would that be a violation? Let's see a show of hands. Would that be a violation of the SPCC rule because that kit sits there undeployed and there's no one there to deploy it? Yes, it's a violation. No, it meets the minimum intent of the rule, but it's a little sketchy. That's more the answer, and then you kind of get to the point of, well, if there's a spill in the forest and it flows into a river and nobody sees it, did it actually happen? Yeah, well, it did happen, and then water quality violations also happen and penalties start getting levied. So that's just some food for thought as an inspector.
So general containment, going back to our discussion on the regulations, it applies to loading and unloading areas. We're talking about piping, above ground piping that's single wall, maybe it's not double wall, oil filled equipment, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then mobile refuelers. I'll talk about that too. And it's the minimum amount of containment that's required. So write that down next to general containment. The minimum amount of containment. It's the minimum expectation for containment at the facility. And it's required for all SPCC facilities. Here's an example that, and I actually was with Pete. We went out to a military facility. They had this huge, amazing, double-wall, state-of-the-art, brand-new tank, and I think it was an emergency generator or something. It was a big tank to supply an emergency generator. And they had single-wall piping that came out of that tank, and it went over to the day tank. And the day tank had containment, but there was no containment for the piping. And it was right, there was a storm, some type of a grate that went into a storm culvert right next to the tank. And we said, okay, what's your containment for your piping? And they said, oh, it's not required. Well, no, it is. You're subject to general containment. Do you have any kind of a spill kit, or something? Because that's usually what you'll see is some type of a spill kit. And they said, well, we can't keep spill kits out there because they get taken. They get stolen or taken by some other crew, or I guess they can't, and it's really expensive for them to put spill kits at all these different locations throughout the military base. So it hadn't come up from their PEs who prepared all their plans, and it just was something that was never thought of, that it was a requirement. But it is. They are required. And so they had to go and put spill kits at all these different locations, and I guess they had to lock them up, and they had to figure out how they were going to solve the problem of spill kits disappearing. And yes, sir?
Is there a definition of the typical failure, most likely discharge? Because, say, your local oil change place.
Okay.
The most typical discharge to that place is oil dripping off of the equipment they use for doing the train, not knocking the drum over. But whereas knocking a drum or a can over is a also likely one, but it's not the most likely. And you should prepare for that eventuality.
The SPCC rule is a performance-based regulation. Unlike underground storage tanks where there are bells and whistles and monitoring devices that are electric and they are the controls for the operation, whereas above ground containers are generally going to be require management actions and performance-based procedures by the owner-operator. And there's a great deal of flexibility, as we've heard, in the SPCC requirements on how to conform to those requirements. And part of the responsibilities for developing, certifying, and implementing an SPCC plan lie with the owner-operator, first and foremost. Then, if they are 10,001 gallons plus, there's a professional engineer certification requirement. For those that are 10,000 below, it's a self-certification as qualified facilities. But the responsibility lies with the owner-operator to make a determination as to what is the most likely discharge, and if there's a professional engineer requirement, they would assist or make those calculations. They would look at flow rates, content amounts in containers, activities, distance to storm drains, procedures that would sort of take to shut off valves, how long that might take. Those are the kind of things that would go into a determination as to what the most likely discharge scenario or volume would be. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Does that make sense?
I think the question was, is there a definition of the typical, what is a typical failure mode, or the definition of most likely discharge? And I think what Pete's saying is the answer is it's really up to the facility to decide what that would be. But I know the guidance, the regional guidance, does give examples of, like Pete's mentioning.
There is no specific definition of a most likely discharge scenario. Let's turn it to Steve Mankus. What would be your comment, Steve, on determining, you're a professional engineer, right?
Yes, I would look for the most likely discharge that is of significance. So in the example you gave, a 55-gallon drum, which is actively being used, would tip over and cause more of a problem than the drips that would come from the equipment on the way in and out. But it is relatively arbitrary.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I said I would talk about oil-filled equipment. Now we're going to talk about it. There's some things to remember. There's some acronyms. We all love acronyms in the Coupa world. So I want you to write down two acronyms. One is OFOE, and it stands for Oil-Filled Operational Equipment. OFOE. And then the next acronym I want you to write is OFME, and it stands for Oil-Filled Manufacturing Equipment. So oil-filled operational equipment, and there's some photos here of the different types of equipment, so you'll see some examples. That would include an oil storage container or multiple containers in which the oil is present solely to support the function of the device or the apparatus. So some examples of that would be hydraulic systems, transformers, gearboxes, machining coolant systems, and other systems where the oil is solely in there to enable the operation of the device. So what was that acronym again? OFOE, oil-filled operational equipment. That type of equipment gets to have general containment. General containment applies for oil-filled operational equipment. Now, before I get to the next definition, I'm just going to briefly talk about oil-filled electrical equipment, which is something we talk about in APSA, because there's an exemption in APSA for oil-filled electrical equipment. Oil-filled electrical equipment is within that OFOE, oil-filled operational equipment. Now we're going to go to the next one, oil-filled manufacturing equipment. And it is equipment that stores oil only as an ancillary element of performing that operation. So it's sort of like the storage tank sitting to supply the oil to the operation of the device. Oil-filled manufacturing equipment is subject to sized containment. Now there's some exceptions, and there's alternatives allowed for oil-filled manufacturing equipment, and that's going to be in a class on impracticability determinations. There are some exceptions and alternatives in the newer amendments. Yes, sir.
Would the elevators be considered oil-filled operational equipment? I've never heard it mentioned, but
okay. Would elevators be considered oil-filled operational equipment?
To get at your question, the reservoir system associated with an elevator, if its capacity is greater than 55 gallons, then yeah, it needs to be considered in the overall threshold determination for SPCC subjectivity. It may be that because it's a standalone system in a building, that with the flexibility in defining a facility, you could say it's possible that that could be identified as its own facility and therefore likely to be, if it's less than 1320, then it could be stated as a facility that is below the threshold and therefore exempt. So if it were above 1320, or if there was a storage container that took the reservoir at 60 gallons and the storage container at 1300, that's 1360, then that may require its own SPCC. You could do a tier 1 plan for that.
Would it be subject to sized containment oil-filled manufacturing?
No. The reservoirs, and I think I kind of am confused. You said manufacturing equipment, where that's not going to be subject to sized secondary containment.
Oh.
Only bulk storage is going to be subject to the sizing requirements of secondary containment for containers. If you got a manufacturing piece of equipment and it's got a process system and the oil's fed into the unit and or used within the unit inherent for its function, that's going to stay in general containment requirements. If there is a bulk storage container that is separate and would be used to dispense into a system, that bulk storage container, and a good example of this would be for emergency generator systems that she mentioned, that would be, say, in the top left photo, you can see the transformer has got a pipe coming out of the wall to the transformer from the bulk storage containers that are inside the dike wall. Or if you had a double wall tank with plumbed to the emergency generator unit itself, the bulk storage container is subject to size containment. But so I don't know if there was some confusion on the manufacturing equipment.
So with the generator example, if you have a storage container piped to a day tank and then right to the generator, the day tank would be general containment and the bulk would be sized.
Yeah, the bulk storage container is always going to be size containment.
Yeah.
The day tank, you could possibly look at that. If it's smaller than, say, 55 gallons and it's more of an expansion in the piping system to it, then you could look at it as part of the transfer systems or piping, albeit it expands and there's some continuous storage, but I would apply general containment and most likely discharge scenario to that particular section of the piping, the day tank, and then the generator unit itself. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to clarify, because on our facility we have 2 separate buildings.
Right.
There are only 2 levels, so we have 1 elevator in each building. They each have a tank that holds the hydraulic fluid to operate the elevators. They're in their own separate, locked room.
Right.
So I was wondering if I'm going to need to have some kind of way of berming the doorway so it can't escape, or is this considered general containment?
Well, you certainly can consider walls and solid floor and the way that the area would provide containment to determine whether it's adequate. Okay, so it's a reservoir system, the oil's going in and out, and
Right.
so it's
But each
sort of
reservoir is right at the 55-gallon amount.
if the reservoir failed and the fluid hit the ground, could it flow under the door?
Yeah.
And where would it go then?
Just into other rooms inside the building.
Right. So really, that capacity, 55 gallons, if it's going to go out the door there, but it's not going to have enough volume to actually get out of the building and into a drainage course, you can claim that as general containment, certainly. As an inspector, I would, take a look and say, well, if you have 55 gallons and it's going to fillet out through into the next room, could it get out of the building and go somewhere? Then probably not.